Lovers, and welcome to 21 Conversations, the 2021 Greensboro Bound Literary Festival. I'm Brian Lampkin, one of the organizers of Greensboro Bound and a co-owner of Scuppernong Books. Greensboro Bound is so excited to present to you these 21 conversations, our effort to create something unique and special for our community within the confines of our continued virtual environment. 21 Conversations pays homage to North Carolina's rich literary history while broadening our tent to welcome in voices from outside of our own microcosm of experience. This featured presentation is but a taste of the 52 authors that we have gathered together in a series of delightful, sometimes unexpected, but always edifying conversations. Since our inception, Greensboro Bound has been committed to providing programs just like the one you're about to watch, 100% free to our community. In order to do that, we need the financial support, both big and small, of readers just like you. Please support Greensboro Bound by giving now. The text to give phone number as well as our website are on your screen. A sustaining gift of just $15 a month, or the cost of a single children's book, will help us remain financially solvent throughout the year. I also want to take a moment to thank our sustaining supporters, without whom Greensboro Bound would just not be possible. Our utmost gratitude to the Edward M. Armfield Sr. Foundation, the Ruth Lands Memorial Fund, and Arts Greensboro for their continued belief in our vision to bring together readers and writers of all genres, ages, ethnicities, identities, and voices to foster an understanding of writing as a process that allows free expression, deepens critical thought, and helps sustain a culture of inquiry and delight that is open to all. Thank you again for joining us for the 2021 Greensboro Bound Literary Festival. Please enjoy the conversation.
Good afternoon. Welcome everyone to this session of Greensboro Bound Literary Festival. And my name is John Cox. I'm a professor at UNC Charlotte, where I direct our Center for Holocaust, Genocide, and Human Rights Studies. And I'm here to introduce our panel today. These are four really great journalists who've produced a really important book called Dirty Gold, The Rise and Fall of an International Smuggling Ring. Many of you out there who will be watching this have heard about the phenomenon of, for example, blood diamonds and of other things about terrible wars and violence fought over minerals in Central Africa and many other parts of the world in recent decades. Well, this book puts a very harsh spotlight on another area of the global economy that is really literally dripping in blood. And in fact, and if I may just quote briefly in the introductory paragraph, the authors quote Pope Francis, who said 3 years ago that gold is, quote, a false god that demands sacrifice. And in fact, the lust for gold has produced a great deal of misery, suffering, and even genocide over the centuries in the Americas and elsewhere. Okay, so with that, I'd like to introduce the four journalists who wrote this book, and then we'll engage in a conversation over the next hour, more or less. And the authors of this book and the investigative journalists who put this book together, probably at some peril, I suspect, are from the Miami Herald, and they are Jay Weaver, Nicholas NEHAMAS, Jim Wyss, and KYRA GURNEY. And so why don't we start by just my asking, perhaps of Nicholas, tell us and tell the audience a bit about the book and about your investigations and conclusions.
Absolutely, and thank you so much for having all of us. We're glad to be with you today. So you may notice there are four of us, four authors of this book, and that's because Dirty Gold was a project that spanned continents, cities. We reported in South America, in Miami, across the United States to tell this tale, because the tale of dirty gold is extremely complex, and the harms that the illegal gold mining industry inflicts are varied. In this book, we discuss environmental destruction of some of the world's most precious rainforests. We discuss how drug traffickers and criminal gangs have infiltrated the gold industry to launder money from their cocaine sales. We talk about the mercury poisoning that has afflicted many indigenous peoples in these gold mining areas. And all of these various harms and ills circle back to, at the end of the day, the American consumer, because we are the people who end up purchasing much of this gold that is illegally mined in Latin America, whether it is in your watch or your jewelry, or your phone, because gold is a very effective conductor. And now in a cell phone, an iPad, a laptop, there are trace amounts of gold. And so there is huge demand for gold. And the reason we wrote this book is we want people to think about where their gold comes from and who is harmed in its creation and sale.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, thank you very much. And that was one of the fascinating and really compelling things about the book, is the way it brought so many things together, including elements of really of global capitalism, of consumerism, along with extreme exploitation of labor, and along with, again, many things that are just beneath the surface when we have we don't think about coltan and many other things. But yeah, could maybe Jim, I thought among the many very fascinating things was about the kind of the culture of the individuals, especially like the so-called three amigos who are at the center of the book, but others in their orbit. A culture of extreme, I guess, well, privilege and entitlement, but also of machismo. And maybe, maybe Jay or others could comment something about that kind of internal culture, which seems to be, it's something that's really connected, or it resonates with other things that have been in the news in recent years.
The three amigos, as they're called in the book, Dirty Gold, really came up through friendships and business relationships in the subprime mortgage business during the real estate boom of the 2000 era. And then they went on to work together at for-profit universities, soliciting unsuspecting students to come to those kind of schools. And then they fell into the dirty gold business. Now, originally, they didn't know it was dirty gold. They thought it was legitimate. They were recruited by a company out of Dallas called Ella Metal to set up a business called NTR Metals in Miami, which was intended to explore and develop and expand Ella Metal's reach in Latin America, because the domestic market in the United States for gold was not as robust as it used to be, and there were efforts to explore new areas of gold. And so Peru was the place to be. Peru has a booming gold economy, in addition to a booming cocaine trade. And of course, this is true of a few other South American countries, including Colombia. So the idea was, to be in this business, it is kind of a macho business. I'm not going to say that they're akin to drug traffickers, but it's dominated by men, macho men with a lot of confidence and swagger. And they're not afraid, to make deals with bad people and to do bad things to make those deals. And so over time in 2013, because this is a tale that does go back to that era, the price of gold was soaring, the opportunities to buy it were numerous in Peru. But to do so, you have to do it through different chains of gold mining, as well as gold sales. And there are sustainable miners, who are artisanal miners on the ground in the Peruvian rainforest, and then there are kind of go-betweens, middlemen, and and the other reporters can talk a lot about that, especially Jim, with regard to Peter Ferrari, who was in Peru and was sort of the main guy selling a lot of gold to the NTR dealers. But that's how this whole story started. And to kind of, come to the quick here, the NTR Metals brokers were the ones that got originally charged in 2017. And that became the foundation for our series as well as our book.
It seems to me that another really very important and powerful part of the book is that it helps the readers to understand that there's a very blurry line between so-called legitimate and so-called illegitimate enterprises and industries around the world. And in fact, your book is actually set in a part of the world where 110 years ago, there was actually genocidal violence carried out against indigenous peoples in the process of rubber tapping and so on. And that's also still been a source of misery for many people in Brazil and in the Amazons and so on. So anyway, but please comment more about what people should know about these, again, very blurry lines between these arenas of the global economy.
I'll take that, John, and thanks for the question. It's a very good one. And that's one of the really fascinating things about gold is that the supply chain is so long. There are so many stages in that process where it can be essentially laundered, where you can turn gold that has been illegally mined by children under horrible conditions, controlled by criminal gangs, or even in cases like Colombia, where you actually have, drug dealers, paramilitary groups, Colombian guerrillas actually in control of mines. But the supply chain is so long to the U.S. consumer that there are all sorts of ways that it can be made to look legitimate, and that's one of the things that makes gold attractive to criminal economies, is that once you get it out of the mine, and particularly once you can mix it with legitimate gold, it's indistinguishable. We not that we talked to drug dealers about this specifically, but many have said, basically, if you're a drug dealer, from the point that you're picking the coca leaves in Peru to the point that you're selling that gram of cocaine on the streets of New York, it's illegal everywhere along the line. And you can get busted everywhere along the line. With gold, as long as you can get it out of the mine and falsify some paperwork and bribe some customs officials, there's nothing illegal about showing up to the airport in Miami or New York with a suitcase full of gold, as long as your paperwork's in order. And getting your paperwork in order in Latin America, as we discovered in this book, is very easy to do. There's entire industries dedicated to making dirty gold look legitimate. And so the line between the legitimate and illegitimate in the gold world is so thin that it's almost impossible not to cross at times, it seems like.
And I think another important point is that a lot of these artisanal miners don't get into gold mining because they're trying to get into the criminal underworld. They're just trying to survive. And sometimes this is the best way to make a living. But because countries like Peru and Colombia require so many permits and environmental permissions and all sorts of things to be able to mine legally, these miners are operating in a gray zone or completely in an illegal zone. And that makes them very vulnerable to control of criminal groups. It also means that they often don't have access to legitimate financing and to safe mining methods.
Yeah, thanks. And another thing I noticed in your book was that I think that you all really evince some real, compassion and concern for the laborers and the workers, and also make distinctions between the kind of, overlords or people who really run things versus, lower level operators, and especially the miners who are, really doing the work. So I wonder if you could maybe just share some more, anecdotes and stories, from the book and or just your experience about just the daily conditions that people were enduring.
Well, John, I'll take the first crack at that because I spent a lot of time in the illegal mining area in Madre de Dios in southern Peru. And there it's just, we Wild West and free for all are phrases that are overused, but I can't think of better ways to really describe this area. 20,000, 30,000 people digging in the muck with no sort of safety mechanisms, no organization, really left to fend for themselves in many ways. This is a part of Peru where even up until recently, even the authorities couldn't really go in. And so the level of danger, working with mercury, digging these alluvial mines with walls that were collapsing on them, and people were dying out there all the time. And then you have these really nasty underworld economies that grow up around that, including child labor and prostitution and sorts of things. And I think it's really important, like KYRA said, these are the kind of the foot soldiers of the illegal mining industry, but none of them really considered themselves illegal miners. Most of them considered themselves subsistence miners, people just trying to make a living. And none of them are really getting rich, much akin to the drug trade. It's people much further up the food chain that are making millions and millions of dollars, where the people who are taking the real risks and essentially just trying to support their family because they don't know what else to do are making very, very little money.
Yeah, on the other end of this kind of social and economic spectrum from these people who you're describing are some rather kind of colorful and outlandish figures, you describe in the book. So maybe tell us a little bit about some of these folks like Peter Ferrari and just other people. And I was interested in the one guy, Ganda, who ended up becomes almost, kind of semi-sympathetic in some ways, I think maybe, but perhaps, I don't know if I'm over speaking there. I haven't been paid by him to say that, but maybe just, tell us a little bit about some of these individuals and how they fit into the story. Oh, yeah.
Unmuted. So maybe we can go around the circle a little bit because we each kind of dealt with various characters. In the book, you already brought up the three Amigos. They are really, the central characters who drive this narrative. They, as Jay said, they're Miami guys who become gold traders traveling around South America out of a base in Miami. And they never got into this because they were hardened criminals. These are family guys. Juan Granda supports his mother. Renato Rodriguez and Samer Barrage both have families. They thought this was an opportunity. And they didn't really ask any questions about where the gold was coming from. And, in the end, they did help hide the source. But they were just kind of salesmen having the time of their lives, traveling around South America, buying gold. And the person who really them began their downfall was probably one of the most colorful characters in the book that Jim spent a lot of time with, actually, interviewing, getting to know, researching in Peru. And that is a man nicknamed Peter Ferrari. And I'll let Jim take over there.
Yes, so Pedro Perez Miranda, aka Peter Ferrari, is this just fantastic character. He really was larger than life. 10 children with 5 different women, ran his kind of growing clan business empire. And he was basically a gold aggregator. He was buying gold in Peru with very few questions asked. During the 1990s, he had this kind of fascinating history that kind of charted the history of Peru itself. Also, in the 1990s, he had been charged with drug trafficking and money laundering, charges which he always denied. Talking about the link between drug trafficking and the gold trade, one of the things he was accused of, again, that he always denied, but I think is kind of an interesting window into that world, where at one point he was being accused of taking lead bricks and covering them in a thin layer of gold and exporting them to Miami. And the idea was that drug dealers in Miami who had shipped up, their Peruvian and Colombian cocaine and had a bunch of cash in the US and needed to get it back to South America, were buying these lead bricks as if they were solid gold. And so he was laundering that money legally or illicitly back into the economy, and he was taking a commission on that. His entire case, he ended up getting acquitted on those charges for reasons which I'll let readers of the book explore, but it has to do with national politics and one of the most tumultuous times politically, although some would argue right now is the most tumultuous time politically in Peru. But it's kind of a fascinating story that takes you through this very crucial history of Peru, where it was basically You had a dictatorship on one side, or essentially a dictatorship on one side, and very, very bloody Marxist and Maoist guerrillas on the other. And this was a guy who was operating in that world and did just fine with it. But like Nick was saying, he was an incredibly colorful character who both despised being called Peter Ferrari and both embraced being called Peter Ferrari. And he was a real contradiction. And we were lucky enough to get to talk to him. And I want KYRA to talk about Chile and Jay to talk about the three amigos further. But I think this is one of the strong points of this book, is that all the defendants in the case we spent quality time with. I think you see a lot of true crime books focused from the prosecutor side or the law enforcement side. And we really had unprecedented access to all the quote unquote evildoers in this book. And I think that's what really kind of elevates it.
Yeah, one of the other interesting characters in the book is a college student named Harold Vilches, and Harold is based in Santiago, Chile, and he comes from a family of jewelers, but his father had, I believe it was a stroke when Harold was about 20 years old, and so Harold had to take over the family business. And what started out as just him keeping the family business going while his dad was in the hospital quickly became something where Harold's ambition and greed really took over, and he starts to build this whole gold smuggling operation. He initially brings the gold from Peru in the car doors, just smuggles it across the border without declaring it, without paying taxes, and exports it to Dubai and various other places. And then eventually he connects with the NTR dealers in Miami and starts exporting gold that he brings illegally over the border with Argentina, all the way to Miami. And I just found him very fascinating. Spent a lot of time interviewing him just because he was so young when he got involved in all of this. And he consistently managed to convince these much older, much more experienced businessmen to invest in him or to believe in him, and then would often double cross them. And then Harold, as readers will learn in the book, eventually becomes part of the NTR metals traders' downfall later on when he decides to cooperate with prosecutors.
Yeah, that was a spoiler alert. Okay, so what? Yeah. Okay. Yeah, he was quite fascinating, and also, your book is a good introduction to people who, so some of us remember the Fujimori regime in Peru, and this was also the same time, it was shortly after the Pinochet dictatorship had finally come to an end in Chile. And those are two countries that have a lot in common, including Pisco, which is a good thing to have in common, which is a liqueur for our audience. Okay. And, but also the book helps also to put a spotlight on the corruption of not only some of these groups, the so-called revolutionary groups, or like the Sendero Luminoso or the Shining Path, but also the Fujimori regime and his security chief Montesinos, and so who was involved in all this. And so I wonder, like, even since, of course, this book was only published a week and a half ago, I think, but which means that I assume you sent it to the publisher several months ago. What other things beyond the book can you tell us about just even developments since then, either in criminal justice or more broadly in, confronting the terrible, really social and human toll of these things that you write about?
Well, one thing that I wanted to introduce as far as the case goes is that, Nick and I spent a lot of time with the law enforcement, prosecutors and agents, and that's a whole story in itself too. And it'll get to your question in a moment, but I think it's important for people to understand that, they had to put together a team, and this was the so-called Fellowship of the Ring, and it had this motley crew of different agents who didn't always agree with each other in tactics and approach and strategy. They were different agencies, so it required a lot of collaboration that typically doesn't come easily among competing agencies. And then you had a young prosecutor, kind of a dashing young Cuban guy who really wanted to make a name for himself. And, he's a smart guy, despite his lack of experience. And he had a certain way he wanted to do this case. And so he had to bring everybody together. And he even had some competition within his own office at the U.S. Attorney's Office in Miami over who was going to run the case. And finally, he pulls all these people together. And, to get to the point of your question, this case was very much a case of first impression. There had not been much of a crackdown on illegal mining or illegal gold exports from South America to Miami. In fact, there'd been virtually nothing going on. And a lot of this is regulated just like Bank Secrecy Act, know your customer type of laws. And so they figured out a way to make this case as a money laundering conspiracy. Nobody was charged with illegal gold mining or drug trafficking or bribery or corruption, but those were kind of the underlying themes or predicates, as these prosecutors like to call them, for the money laundering case. And so they made this case. It was a $3.6 billion case, which isn't about profits, just about the value of the gold. So that gives you some idea of how much gold was coming in from South America. And there were these peripheral characters too, who helped NTR Metals and others, finance these deals. And, there's a whole nother character, a wealthy guy from New York who used to be in the health, beauty, merchandising and marketing business that made a fortune off that and was figuring out a way to kind of diversify, into something else. And so he ended up financing a lot of the NTR deals. But it was a case of first impression. The NTR Metals guys were charged. Other people were not. Ferrari was charged. And nothing has happened in the case since the original charges. COVID was a factor. The pandemic was a factor. But it's like a case happened. There was a crackdown. There was a sudden chill. It lasted about a year or so. And then things started picking up again, which we can address a little later in the interview. But, I'll toss it back to Nick because, there were a lot of issues going on in Peru at the time and in the United States at the time. This is 2017, 18, 19. But things did change after the crackdown. And he can talk a little bit more about that.
So I'd say that, like Jay said, there was a chill. All these American companies were bringing a ton of gold from South America into the United States. And then one of the biggest, NTR Metals and, its parent company, Elemental, got smacked down by federal law enforcement. So you saw, one big gold refiner in Miami, one of the biggest in the world, went bankrupt. Another shut down. Less gold started coming into Miami. That didn't necessarily change the situation on the ground where the mining is happening, because the United States is not the only gold market in the world. In fact, China and India are bigger gold markets. And so you saw buyers from those countries start scooping up a lot of gold. You saw Swiss buyers, that's another gold market, and buyers from the Emirates in the Middle East. And perhaps later, Jim can talk about the efforts of Peruvian authorities to crack down on illegal mining in the jungle and the difficulties they've faced. Whether it's Peruvian authorities, American authorities, it's a game of whack-a-mole. The gold is there in the ground. It's easy to get. There's a gold rush happening, and there are buyers around the world who aren't going to be asking too many questions. If one country starts asking questions like the United States, there's another country that needs gold.
Also, maybe you all could, because you've done this reporting for the Miami Herald, and it seems like, and there's one passage in your book that kind of succinctly captures this idea of Miami as being such a crossroads, and among many other things, being halfway between Guayaquil and I don't know where, New York, I guess. I don't know what's equal distance from Guayaquil to Miami, but also just Miami as being, as many of us know, just really a crossroads in many ways, and so maybe just tell us a little bit about even how your team came together and ended up working on this, and how that's, you really, I would imagine is related to Miami's international character and so on.
Well, I'll start with a little bit of that, and then we can pass the baton. This was a story I'd never seen before on my beat. I cover the federal courts, and I had been writing a lot about corruption and drug trafficking and terrorism and fraud and all those things. And in Miami, there's a lot of it. It's mind-boggling. It's on the scale of New York, possibly surpasses New York for just the grab bag of stuff that goes on here. And so this gold case was unique. And I started talking with Nick about it because he was on the investigative team. And I said, I've never seen anything like this. And what's even more astonishing, there seems to be drug traffickers that are driving this gold trade. And moreover, nobody knows anything about this. And they're saying it's bigger than cocaine. And there are so many characters and so many tentacles to this story. I think we're going to have to team up here. And so, I'll pass it to Nick, but I did some of the daily reporting, but then we started realizing we have a major project here, a major series, and I'll let him take it from there, and then he can pass it along.
Yeah, I mean, I jumped at the chance. I was part of the team, and so was Jim, actually, that did the Panama Papers a couple of years ago about the offshore tax havens. And so I have a lot of familiarity with money laundering. I was also a business reporter before joining the I-Team, and I had no idea that Miami was the United States' capital of gold, of importing gold. And that's because we're so close to Latin America. And also, as Jay said, I mean, we're like a Casablanca for the Western Hemisphere. There's just a lot of shady business that happens here. And, I jumped at the chance. And as we pursued the story, we realized this wasn't just a business story. This wasn't a federal court story. This was a story that would require on-the-ground reporting to tell the stories of these struggling subsistence miners and the destruction that was happening. And I knew that we needed reporters who had lived and worked in Latin America. And the Herald is a local newspaper, but we are an extremely diverse community. 1 of every 2 people in Miami-Dade County is actually born abroad, I believe. And so stuff that happens in Colombia and Peru and Venezuela is local news in a sense. And we had 2 reporters at the Herald, thank God, who specialized in Latin American reporting, and Jim Wyss and KYRA GURNEY. So I'll throw it to Jim and KYRA.
KYRA, you want to take over?
Sure. So, Jim was based in Bogota at the time and obviously had a lot of experience reporting in Latin America. And I had previously worked as a reporter in Colombia for a few years. And I had worked for a news outlet called Insight Crime that focuses on organized crime. So I was a bit familiar with the illegal gold trade and had some contacts there. So that's how I started working with this group on the series.
And in Colombia, so I was in Colombia from 2011 to 2019, and by about 2015, 2016, more and more people, even the president himself, were saying, the illegal gold trade is doing more to finance illegal armed groups than cocaine is now. The government itself was seriously concerned about the FARC, the ELN, and other criminal organizations getting into the illegal gold trade. And so that in fact was a big part of our original series. Once it became a book, it became clear that we needed to tell the full story of the 3 Amigos. And the 3 Amigos story really kind of develops in Peru. And that's how Peru came into the mix. And it was, as you mentioned at the beginning, it was very fortuitous and very interesting that I happened to be following the Pope on his trip through South America. And, he visited Madre de Dios, the hemisphere's largest illegal gold mine. And he seemed visibly shocked by what he'd seen, which almost everybody seems visibly shocked if they actually have the opportunity to take a look at what's happening in this little area of the world that's also one of the most biodiverse and beautiful areas of the world. I mean, the contrasts are just incredibly striking.
Jim, can you describe what it actually looks like, either on the ground or from the air?
Well, and that's the thing, because on the ground, it's kind of hard to take it all in. For most people who are even know La Pampa, which is the big illegal gold mining area, they usually see it because they're taking a tourist bus from Cusco with the Incan ruins and the Inca Trail, and going down to usually the Tambopata National Reserve. These incredibly biodiverse areas where you get to go see monkeys and jaguars and endemic birds and stuff. And so you drive right beside La Pampa, but it's kind of blocked off by kind of a row of shanties. And just beyond those shanties, there's just this lunar landscape full of glowing blue and orange and yellow chemical lakes. In 2015, a police patrol had gone into La Pampa searching for somebody, and they actually got lost, in this area because there are no waypoints. Ended up dying of thirst out there. so that just kind of gives you a sense that you're in the middle of a rainforest, you're in the middle of the Amazon jungle, and they're dying of thirst, yet surrounded by water that's just too toxic to drink. So this area of La Pampa, it itself is 45 square miles, but it's part of this network of illegal and informal mines that stretches 200 miles. It's this huge teardrop-shaped hellhole that as Nick likes to point out, NASA just recently put out some pictures where you can see it from space. That's the level of devastation there right now.
Yeah, and I think probably some people in our audience might, I mean, when I read that description in your book, it made me think of the photographs by Sebastião Zagado, the great Brazilian photographer of those. I don't know if that's 10, I'm not sure what kind of mines those are that his photos from Brazil, from the massive kind of, crater-like mines.
Yeah, I don't think those were gold mines, but it's the same dynamic.
Yeah.
Unregulated, overcrowded, out of control mining.
There will probably be in the last few pages of your book, you try to offer, I guess, some prescriptions, but also some things people can do. When people read a book like this, they're spurred to action, as they should be. And there's no simple answers, that's for sure. Which again, I think y'all do a sensitive and nuanced job of explaining in the last pages of the book, is really throughout the book. But what are some small things? I mean, boycotting anything that has, a lot of people have tried to boycott their iPhones because of coltan from Congo, and that no one's gonna, I don't know if that's caught on, but what are some practical and effective things that people can do to take a stand about this?
Well, there are efforts and have been efforts for a number of years now. This is not new, where you have, NGOs, you have nonprofits, you have artisanal gold councils, you've got, biodiversity professors working collaboratively, some directly with each other, some indirectly, to come up with ways to develop safer practices of mining gold, to avoid, the use of mercury. I know some have suggested cyanide as an alternative. I know that seems extraordinary because it's equally toxic. But I think there have been efforts to create incentives to develop safer methods of mining gold in these subsistence areas that Jim was describing. The larger mines, the ones that really aren't in these Andean alluvial areas that are more dedicated mines owned by conglomerates, that's a different kind of mining. And they have different methods and different controls. But the problem areas are really these subsistence miners. And they, on the one hand, look like outlaws. But what we all came to learn was they're really just trying to survive. And so they need to be provided incentives by their governments to mine these areas lawfully. And that's a complicated challenge. And so it requires some deliberate efforts on the part of the government to work with these groups. And there are thousands and thousands of people doing this. And it is a gold rush kind of atmosphere. And they're competing with each other. So, people want to cut corners. They use mercury too much to, extract the gold from the rock ore, et cetera. And it's a very inefficient way of doing it. It's a very toxic way of doing it. And it destroys not only the environment, but the food chain. And so a lot of this needs to be continually addressed. And so I think in the end, our book was intended to not only raise the consciousness level, like blood diamonds did in the conflict areas of Central Africa, but also to, emphasize to consumers that you need to be mindful of this, and to corporations, because there were a lot of NTR Metals corporations who bought gold. There were a lot of Fortune 500 corporations that bought gold from NTR Metals, and it had a devastating effect on workers at Elemental's refinery in Ohio. And Jim can speak to that a little bit. It not only had a devastating effect down in South America and in Peru in particular, and some of these neighboring South American countries, but also in our backyard in rural Appalachia. And Nick should talk about that because it's a really important point.
Yeah, thanks, Jay. So NTR Metals and Ella Metal actually purchased a refinery in Jackson, Ohio, which is not far from the West Virginia border. It was an area that was extremely prosperous in the early 20th century, late 19th century, thanks to the steel industry and iron. And as with much of the rest of the country, it lost its manufacturing base, in the 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, until today, it's one of the poorest parts of Ohio. But a local businessman in the 70s decided to open a gold recycling facility. And it grew and became one of the largest in the US. Ella Metal bought it when they all of a sudden had this huge supply of gold from Latin America. And the plant hired hundreds of people. It was the governor came when the plant decided to expand to give a press conference. It was the Wall Street Journal did a story about a gold refinery in the middle of rural, Appalachian, Ohio. Who would think of that? Now, what's so moving about this story, these workers, desperate for jobs, we interviewed some of them and they began to wonder where all this gold was coming from. And one of them even Googled, Peruvian gold, and he saw a photo of a child diving into what looked like, a toxic pit of water and mud and gold with a hose to hoover up gold particles from the bottom of this pit. And he said he showed it to a manager there at the company. And the manager said, well, the kid's making 14 cents a day. It's good for them. And so I don't want to give, too much away, but in the end, the plant closed down. Tons of people lost their jobs. It was economically devastating. But, this one worker who'd worked there for decades said in the end, it was the right thing. He didn't feel right, making money off the misery of, tens of thousands of people abroad. Now, he had his eyes open. I think it's pretty clear that a lot of the corporate executives that we write about did not. And just to tie it back to Jay's original point, I do think there's a role for consumers here, just like with blood diamonds. Consumers, maybe boycotts aren't the most effective. Everyone needs an iPhone. But consumers can put pressure on companies to be very transparent about their supply chains. Because as Jim alluded to earlier, the reason it's so easy to launder this illegitimate gold is that, there could be 20 companies that buy and sell gold from the time it's mined to the time it gets into your jewelry or iPhone. So companies, and they're working on this, some of them need to know exactly where the gold is coming from. The best supply chain is one where the gold goes directly from a legal, titled, sustainable mine to an importer in the US to a company. And there is, efforts from the federal government to make that happen. The Obama administration, for instance, forced companies to disclose their suppliers of gold and other precious metals. The Trump administration rolled that back. I'm not sure what Biden is doing, but all that to say, there are ways that consumers can pressure governments and companies to step up and do better.
And I think another thing consumers can do, this isn't an option necessarily for every product we buy that contains gold, but for something like a wedding ring or a piece of gold jewelry, there are organizations that will actually certify that the gold is what they call fair mined, meaning that it hasn't been mined in conditions that are difficult for the workers. It has had a minimal environmental impact, and it hasn't been mined in an area where it's contributing to organized crime or to money laundering. However, that gold is a bit more expensive, but I think as more and more consumers are aware of this issue and more people kind of do more research when they're buying jewelry, when they're buying gold, hopefully there will be more organizations offering that type of gold and the prices will go down.
That reminded me, I was going to ask something about Glenn Beck, who appears once or twice in your book, but I don't want to bring him back when people have hopefully forgotten about him. But are there some examples of people there organize? I mean, it's extremely difficult. I'm speaking as a former labor organizer who worked in difficult conditions in meatpacking plants and textile mills in the South and the US. But it's a lot more difficult to organize at, at Monte de Dios and places like that. But are there any examples of either organizing among the people who are suffering the worst from this, that is minor, and or, you know, social movements. Like, I mean, and I'm just know a little bit about in Brazil, there were things like the movement of landless peasants and so on in the last 30 years that helped to organize other, you know, and of course there've been powerful social movements throughout South America and Latin America and you know, in the last 20 or 30 years. But are there some, you know, inspiring examples of activism, of collective action in this region?
That's a really good question, John. And I can just speak for Mano de Dios, and I don't think it's going to be the answer that you were looking for, because, but it kind of shows how complex the situation is. So in the Madre de Dios region, in the Pampa region, the miners themselves were getting extorted and robbed, and you know, they were working within this highly criminalized environment. And so one of the things they did was they essentially created their own armed force paramilitary group that they call the Guardianes de la Trocha. And depending on who you talk to, the Guardianes de la Trocha, which means Guardians of the Trail, initially started off as like a motorcycle cooperative. And they basically did the equivalent of paving the road in the illegal gold camps by laying down planks and driving motorcycles, and they would give miners a ride into the gold fields every day. And so they worked kind of like a union. And then there's an armed element of these guys. And the idea was that the Guardians of the Trail were defending the miners from outsiders who were trying to steal their gold and extort them. The government sees the Guardians of the Trail as yet one of the largest, probably the most dangerous criminal group in the area. And so there's a lot of efforts to organize, but a lot of them have become, a lot of those organizations have kind of become part of the problem as well. And so that's kind of the dynamic that's happening there. I mean, there are a lot of people there are a lot of mining unions, there are a lot of human rights groups that are trying to work with the miners. As Jay, Nick, and KYRA were saying, basically trying to get them to adopt best practices within this incredibly difficult context. You know, even if even marginal changes can make a big difference. Even if it's like, all right, they're all basically using mercury illegally out there. And so, like, you know, there are people who are out there who are saying, you know, we know we're not going to wean you off of mercury overnight, but this is what you need to do to protect yourself, and this is what the minimal things you could do to protect the environment. And by the way, you know, you can recapture more of the mercury you're using and reuse it, so it's good all around. So again, I don't think that answers your question, but that's kind of the dynamic I saw on the ground. But
there are, you know, in brief, there are, in the first world versus third world, you know, dichotomy. There are people in the first world, academic types, like this nonprofit, you know, Artisanal Gold Council out of Victoria, British Columbia, and they're spearheading efforts to work with certain groups in these areas. And, you know, they explained to me that it's a constant challenge, and it's, you know, 2 steps forward, 1 step back kind of situation. But they are recognizing that there have to be collaborations with the local governments, with these groups, and there have to be economic incentives for them to adopt these better practices of mining gold, and that they are, you know, using certain examples. And there are international, you know, protocols as well. This isn't just something that's done on a hodgepodge basis. There are some international protocols, but implementing them and following them is a whole different issue.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I guess, yeah, let me ask too, maybe to KYRA or anyone else. I mean, what are some, based on this work, what do you think your next project, you know, related and or not totally related, maybe project or projects might be?
I think at this point, we're also kind of recovering from this project because we were working on it while we all had fairly demanding full-time jobs. So it ended up being one of those things where, you know, you're working on it early in the morning before work and late at night. But I think another trade that I think is really fascinating and also problematic is the emerald trade in Colombia. That's another mining trade that doesn't get a lot of attention and that has been linked to criminal groups and all sorts of criminal activity.
Okay, that's very interesting. Yeah. Are there any minerals that are untainted? Well, there probably aren't. Okay.
I mean, through this book, I think it's probably already exists, but if not, I do hope somebody writes it. I think there's an incredible story to be told about mercury, and there's a huge illegal mercury trade that underpins the illegal gold trade, and it's just fascinating. Mercury as an element is just, I mean, as we were looking in the. Again, there's a lot of talk in this book. A big chunk of this book is about the environmental effects of illegal gold mining, and that all ties back into mercury. And mercury, we discovered during the reporting of this, it's just as slippery as the element as the metal itself. It works in really insidious ways. So, just a quick example, and not to go too deep into the weeds. But the elemental mercury that we're all familiar with in thermometers. It's toxic, but it's really hard for the body to absorb. But once it's in a riverbed, for example, it becomes methyl mercury and magnifies up the food chain really quickly. And so you have these Peruvian catfish, which are basically just like swimming toxic mercury dumps. And so you'll have very idyllic villages, little fishing communities, far removed from the mining camps, where they have mercury toxicity levels that are out of control, even more so than the miners themselves, because the miners are eating essentially imported protein. They're eating chickens and cows that are being brought in from neighboring provinces, where these little indigenous communities, they have 100% of their protein essentially is coming from the river, and they're poisoned. So anybody out there listening to it at the Greensboro Bound Literary Festival, I want to read your book about mercury.
Yeah, that could be a book by, what's that guy's name? Who wrote Cod and so on. He's a great writer. He wrote a great book on 1968 and so on. Forgot his name. Okay. But I mean, that's among the many virtues of your book, is it really brings things together right from the get-go. The first few pages really help to, convince the reader about how all these things interlock. We often use the word globalization in kind of a vague way in the last 20 or 30 years, but I think your book really shows how a lot of these things, come together, often for the worse. Okay, well, thanks very much to our participants. Thanks very much to Jay, Nicholas, and KYRA and Jim. This was an excellent discussion. Your book is very important. It makes a real powerful contribution. And thanks so much for being part of the Greensboro Bound Literary Festival.
Thank you so much, John. We've really enjoyed this. It's been a lot of fun.
Thank you. We enjoyed it.
Thanks for having us. And if you haven't bought the book yet, please pick it up from your local bookstore if you can. Thank you.
Which is Scuppernong if you live in Greensboro.
Thank you again for joining us for 21 Conversations. If you enjoyed this presentation, please like and share with your friends and fellow readers. One final reminder that Greensboro Bound is a nonprofit organization committed to bringing together readers and writers throughout the year at zero cost to our community. Please help Greensboro Bound maintain that commitment with a sustaining or one-time gift now. The number to text to give and our website are on your screen. Thank you. We look forward to seeing you in person next year.